Let's hop in here, Sam. It's great to meet you. Thank you so much for taking a minute out for the program today. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you bet. So I'm fascinated by the behavioral science aspect, former senior executive, all of these avenues merging. Before we get into your good work, I want to know this. 6 years ago, this pandemic changed all of our lives in massive ways. How did you get through that coronavirus era, and how has it affected the way that you work and live in 2026?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I think nobody has, remotely contemplated something like COVID, right? And it was obviously disruptive for everyone. But peculiarly for me, it became unexpectedly clarifying. I'd spent decades in constant motion, so new countries, new industries, new challenges, and suddenly everything stopped, right?
Mhm.
And in that stillness, I actually learned to find new focus. I rediscovered relationships. The busyness of professional life had quietly crowded out some of the most important people in my world, and COVID gave them back to me. I rediscovered my love of fitness. So, what's funny is I had a rowing machine for years in my basement, right? And I think maybe I'd rowed about 60, 70 miles on it in the previous 2 years. In the first 10 months of COVID, I put on 600 miles on that machine,
Wow.
right? So that machine became my anchor. It gave me structure and discipline when everything else around me felt uncertain. And I also went deep into Stoicism. So I found extraordinary parallels with my background in behavioral science. The Stoics were essentially asking the same types of questions that I think that we are all struggling with, but thousands of years earlier. So that thinking led me to my second book, Uphill: Mastering Life's Toughest Challenges with Stoicism and Science, and it planted the seeds for my latest book, The Uncertainty Edge. Now, you asked how has it shaped 2026? Look, I'm more intentional now, or at least I try to be, about who I spend time with, what work I take on, and what I'm really building towards. So, in many ways, COVID didn't just help me survive. I think it helped me get clearer on what thriving actually means for me at this stage of my life.
So speaking of this stage of your life, if I was to put you in front of a bunch of kids, 12, 13 year olds, it's career day, you're in a school, and one of the kids just wants to know what you do for a living. How do you synthesize this and make it make sense?
Oh, I wish I could say I was an astronaut or a fireman or something like that that they would understand. But I'd probably say something like this, Joe. You know how some people completely freeze when things get scary or uncertain, like before a big test or when something unexpected happens. And yet there are other people that somehow manage to stay calm and try to figure out what to do. Well, my job is to help people be that second kind of person. I study why we make the decisions we make, especially when we're stressed or scared or don't have all the answers. And let's face it, that's probably most of the time for most of us, right? And then I teach leaders, people who run companies, who advise others on big, important decisions, how to think more clearly in those moments. So I would tell these kids to think of me as a coach, but instead of training your body, I train how you think. And honestly, the foundations for that kind of thinking, the curiosity, the resilience, the not panicking when things change, I think those things start getting built at exactly that age of 12, 13.
So what did you want to be at that age? When you were a kid, what was your dream gig?
Well, we spoke earlier. I wanted to be center fielder for the Montreal Expos,
Okay.
which existed at that point and, didn't. But, and a switch hitter after a lot of my favorite baseball players at that time. But, reality struck and realized that, I couldn't hit a fastball. So, I had to think of something else. And so I actually think I wanted to be a scientist,
Okay.
someone who invents or discovers something, who figures out how things actually work. I was always endlessly curious, and I loved the idea of creating something that hadn't existed before. And in a very funny way, that's exactly what I ended up doing, just with a different kind of lab, if you will. Behavioral science is the science of why humans think and decide the way they do. I've spent my entire career trying to understand that and then turn it into frameworks that actually help people. The 12-year-old who wanted to figure out how things work, I think he'd recognize what I would do. He'd just be surprised at the path that it took to get there.
You know, it's interesting, Malcolm Gladwell, that's kind of what he does. There's a
Right.
level
Yeah.
of analyzing, which I always find absolutely fascinating whenever you break down kind of these mass quantities of how human beings respond. Like, for instance, I remember last year reading a book on how things go viral. What is the exact nature? You know, sometimes it's a mystery, other times there's just really small steps that lead up to it. But how human phenomenon explodes and becomes ever present in our lives is still kind of a mysterious orb, but it can get broken down by looking at behavior.
You can. I think you make a great point. And Malcolm Gladwell, I love the way that he writes to take, it's not his science, but he takes science that is there, that is unapproachable for most people, and puts it in the form of stories and everything else that is more relatable. And you're 100% right, Joe, that human behavior, we're only beginning to crack what it means and how to navigate it, which is what I think makes it so fascinating. We deal with people all the time. We deal with the consequences of people's decisions, and yet we're not exactly sure how people arrive at that. And to your point about things being viral, the same, it's not a formula, right? It's not an algorithm that you can sit there and say, I did it this way yesterday, and I got millions of views, etc. I'm going to do exactly the same thing tomorrow, and you might get 10. So the nuances are there, and I think it's the understanding that nuances and gaps that I think makes things difficult, but also very interesting.
And I think that the interesting thing too is breaking down sports. Like when I think about that hit in the World Series, when it went underneath the wall and how the camera was shaking and the Rogers Center was just like pulsing, right? And you're a human being out there, and not many of us will feel what that's like to be a
Right.
player out there, to go through the emotions. Do I wave the ump over and say it's stuck? Do I grab it and throw it? What moment do you get stuck in? And in those moments, when you think about athletes and what they do, that's on a much grander scale. But can you imagine the pressure? Because at the end of the day, they're humans. But then you add all of these thousands of screaming humans and then all of this pressure. It's like no wonder, but they make it look easy. And it seems like they have a script, but they're like us. We're just navigating, trying to find a flashlight in the dark.
Look, that's a great analogy, and I think you're 100% right. Look, those players are human. The players make it look easy. And I think the lesson for all of us is that's just training and practice, right? They're practicing those plays, they're building that muscle memory. So when those situations occur, they're better placed to react and respond to it. It's the same thing with first responders. The challenge, I think, for fans and audience and the Monday morning quarterbacks is they, as you say, they can't put themselves in that position. And yes, you've trained for it. Yes, you're paid lots of money. But in the moment, when all that pressure is on you, when all that noise is around you, how do you react? 9 times out of 10, they're going to react well and make the play. There's always the time that it doesn't. I saw after the Olympics, when Canada unfortunately lost the gold to both in the men's and the women's to the US, there are lots of, again, Monday morning quarterbacks, et cetera, saying, well, maybe this should have happened or that shouldn't have happened. I mean, it's an easy thing to say
Yeah,
when you're sitting at home, 5,000 miles away, watching it on TV, sipping a cold beverage, et cetera. It's a very different thing to exercise that same kind of judgment when the pressure is on. And I
absolutely.
think all of those players, as you say, because of training, because of frameworks, because of mental models that they've put in place, are better able to deal with it than the weekend warrior, etc.
Yeah,
But I think the
absolutely.
lesson, as you say, where maybe we can draw on it, and what I try to draw on in my work is that same kind of thinking and discipline about training, about experience, about frameworks that you can use. I think all of us can create and build to react under pressure in our day-to-day lives in the way that these professional athletes do.
So take me back to your beginnings. How did the acumen for behavioral science, being an executive, being in the business world, analyzing human behavior, how did these things become central to the evolution of your career?
As I tell the story, I think that my life is about change. So I was born in India. Was 5 when I moved to Canada and landed in a major snowstorm in Montreal. And over the next 13 years, I moved around Canada to 8 different schools because of my father's job as an engineer, took him to different parts of the country. I actually went to 3 different high schools, etc. So I was always in a new environment, dealing with uncertainty, figuring out how things work and how to make tick. I was the new kid in the class, for most of my life. And then I met in grad school, I met an exchange student from Austria who later became my wife. We then moved to the UK, where I started a new career because she had a job that in London, England, and I switched from being a lawyer in Toronto to being an investment banker in London. Did that for 10 years. We had our daughter, and then we moved back to Canada. And as I joke, the only Canadian-born member of our family is our dog, Rocky, right? So we're the quintessential global family. And then when I came back, largely because having worked 80, 90 hours a week in my investment banking life, I wanted to watch my daughter grow up and, have that balance between professional and personal. And I switched into wealth management, building and running wealth management businesses for UBS, Manulife, Hancock, and Canada Life. And the fascination with this behavioral science component really crystallized in the 2008 Great Recession. Because up to that point, I was the classic finance guy that rational markets, efficient markets, that people made rational decisions, etc. And I had the privilege of dealing with many of Canada's top billionaires as clients. And they are, by all definitions of the word, sophisticated and able to handle risk. And the people that told me in 2007 that they could handle all the risks that the market brings, I found them panicking in 2008 and 2009. And so that's when it, dawned on me that there's something else going on here. So that actually got me interested in looking into the idea of behavioral finance and why we make decisions that we do. And I got nerdy enough that it fascinated me so much that I ended up doing a doctorate in behavioral finance at the University of Manchester, where my thesis was actually how do investors and financial advisors make decisions? How do they decide what is risky and what is not risky? And that's in a nutshell been my journey. And since then, since I left the corporate world, I do a lot of keynote speaking. I've written a few books, all around this theme of behavioral science, decision making, and thriving in a world that is increasingly uncertain.
So when you get into the mind of those people that can get cavalier with money and do investments and take risks, are they the first ones that jump out of an airplane? Do they have, is their acumen that kind of mentality where they're just like, let's go? They have some daredevil bone, yet faith in the unknown?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is nuanced. What I was actually surprised and fascinated by with my research is that pe people are risky or less risky in different domains of their life. They're not universally the same.
Yeah,
So somebody who's an extreme sports junkie might actually be very, very conservative when it comes to investing.
yeah,
So there's no reason that those things translate across domains. Another interesting strand of research is around entrepreneurs. So why do entrepreneurs take all of this risk? There's a lot of fascinating results that show that it's not that they're more risk taking. It's just that they don't perceive it as risky. They think it's more risky to take like a corporate 9 to 5 job as opposed to starting this business. So it's an endlessly fascinating discussion about how we perceive risk and how we react on that risk. And I think one of the big challenges in even in the investment world, for instance, is the definition of risk. There's a technical and call it mathematical definition of risk that to some extent contradicts just human common sense. And part of the challenge is for an advisor or for an investor is to reconcile those two very different conceptions of what actually risk is.
Who's been your inspirational force in your life to evolve to this point through navigating careers and geography? Who has been that heroic force for you?
There's been many. So I'll mention one and then expand on the second. So any Canadian knows Terry Fox. So Terry Fox was an 18-year-old cancer survivor in 1981-82 from the west coast of Canada. He had his one leg amputated at the knee. And for most 18-year-olds who would be partying, and certainly somebody who at that with that kind of a diagnosis who might not have had many years to live and wanted to enjoy life, nobody would have blamed them for enjoying life as much as they could have. Terry took a very different approach. He decided to run across Canada to raise money for cancer research. So he ran the equivalent of a marathon on one leg every single day for almost a year and making it to the middle of Canada. I happened to be in the town, I living in that town when Terry was going through, and I saw him come through. And unfortunately, the cancer had spread, so he had to stop at that point. They flew him back to home out west, and he died shortly thereafter. But every year since then, including now, there is an annual Terry Fox run raising millions of dollars for cancer research in memory of Terry Fox.
Oh,
But he's always been a hero to me in that sense of somebody that is could have easily been self-absorbed given his personal tragedy, but instead decided to do something about it.
wow. So, what is the energy for you every day to wake up, to stay up on research, to help clients, write books, take care of your own soul, your family? When that alarm clock goes off, what gets you going?
I think it's the possibility that today's conversation or today's idea might really change how someone thinks about a challenge that they're facing. I know that sounds hairy-fairy and lofty, but I mean it practically. So when I'm working with a leader who's stuck, they're paralyzed by uncertainty, making decisions from fear rather than clarity, and then something shifts for them, that's deeply satisfying for me. I also think the discipline of fitness, for me personally, plays a real role. Starting the day with physical effort, whether that's rowing, running, or lifting weights, it sets a tone. It reminds me that hard things are doable if you just begin. And I think that philosophy is something that carries over across everything I do.
So, in this pendulum of life that goes back and forth, the nice things that people do for us can change the trajectory and our depth of empathy and how we live our lives. What's one of the nicest things that someone's ever done for you in your life?
Uh, so the thing that comes to mind, and two people were responsible, and I'll talk about it. I'm not sure I'd be here, sitting here with talking to you without either of them. So when my wife and I were moving to London, she had a job opportunity, and I was essentially starting over, leaving corporate law with no network in the UK. A client of mine named Catherine didn't have to do anything, but she took the time to connect me with a former colleague at a bank in London who then walked my CV directly to the heads of corporate finance. That single act of generosity opened a door that I couldn't have opened myself.
Wow.
At the same time, my mentor, Mike, from the law firm, wrote me a 3-page reference letter. But it's one line that I still carry with me today. He wrote that beyond my technical skills and work ethic, what stood out was that I treated the junior-most clerk in the mailroom with the same respect I gave the senior-most partner in the firm. And that line stopped me. It still does. And that's 30, almost 40 years ago, because it's a reminder that how you show up to me, it's a reminder that how you show up for everyone, not just the people who can do something for you, defines your character. And what Catherine did and what Mike did for me shaped not just my investment banking career, but it shaped everything that came after.
So let's say you have a dream tonight. You run into that young version of you that's going to play for the Montreal Expos. And you walk up to that young version, and there's a film projector next to him. And you click play your age right now, and it shows a 60-second highlight reel of the choices and the life you've lived. Would that young version of you believe that this is the life that has become?
Not a chance. I think that the young person, was probably in the second or third high school at that point, having moved all over, not sure who he was, where he belonged, if he belonged. He certainly wasn't picturing climbing Kilimanjaro or running the Boston Marathon or cycling from London to Monaco or building businesses overseeing billions of dollars or writing books that people read. But here's what I think, where I hope that young version of me would recognize the curiosity, the restlessness, the refusal to be paralyzed by not having all the answers. I think those were always there. He'd see the thread running through it all, hopefully, even if he couldn't have predicted where it led. And I think he'd be maybe relieved, that something did amount to all of this, that maybe even a little proud to know that all of those moves, all of those starting over, all of that uncertainty that it actually ended up adding to something. I think it reminds me when you ask me about this question, I think the quote that comes to mind is one I love by a famous Danish philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard. Life must be lived forwards, but can only be understood backwards. I
Yep.
never understood what that meant but every year I live now, I have a better understanding of why that is so true, right?
Sometimes we just have to be on this planet long enough to understand what those wise philosophical elders were trying
Yeah,
to say, right?
exactly.
So, at the root of behavioral science, I see it as a huge funnel of all these things getting thrown in, and one of those things is AI. And we
Mhm.
get stuck in the conversation. Is it dangerous? What's it going to do? But more than anything else, I'm wondering, do you embrace AI? Do you embrace ChatGPT? Do you embrace it as a tool to kind of enhance your experience as a human?
So that's a great question, and I'll give it a two-part answer. Look, it's a tool, and I believe all tools have value if you remember it's a tool. And the example that I will use is GPS. Okay, GPS is a great tool. But every year, you still read about people following their GPS into a dry riverbed or a wet riverbed, etc., right? So what they've done is substitute their judgment for a tool.
Yeah.
And I think that's what worries me about AI or any tool. If you use it to complement your thinking or your work, it is excellent. And that's exactly how it should be used. If you're using it to substitute your judgment, and I honestly believe that that's what AI is being used for by a lot of people today, and that is what uh, the companies, the founders of the companies that are creating these algorithms, in fact, are trying to push us to do. I think that is very dangerous. So let me give you an example. I talked about my investment banking career. I've written about this a number of times. So when I started in investment banking, I worked 80, 90 hours a week often till 1 or 2 in the morning, building spreadsheet models, creating presentations, etc. Now, was that grunt work? Sure. Can AI reduce that work by substantial margins? Sure. The biggest investment banks like Goldman Sachs and others are saying they think they can, cut the number of analysts that they hire by 30 or 40,000 a year. Now, does that sound like a great deal? Sure. But here's the part that I worry that people are missing. Okay. That work that I did, that grunt work I did, it taught me judgment. It taught me experience. It gave me the ability. When I analyzed 30 companies and went through the slog of doing it, it gave me the experience to be able to analyze it the next 30 without going through the same work. The companies that are talking about replacing all of these junior bankers, the junior lawyers, the junior coders, where do they think the experience comes to lead a deal, to negotiate that contract, to program that life-changing program? Like, if we're cutting that jobs today, those entry-level jobs, where are the leaders in 2045? Where are they going? Where are we going to find them?
Yeah.
We haven't invested in them. We haven't trained the judgment, the experience, etc., which you started it by asking behavioral science. In my way, what behavioral science really tries to understand is how do we build judgment and I think a lot of that judgment comes from experience.
Yeah.
And if you take away the opportunity to gain that experience, I think we're doing the young people a disservice. I think we're doing companies a disservice. I think we're doing society a disservice. The analogy I use, I mean, I'm old enough, and maybe some of your listeners are like the original Karate Kid. If people remember, Daniel wanted to learn how karate, and Mr. Miyagi had him come paint his fence, or wax his car. So wax on, wax off became a funny comment. And Daniel, after a week, got frustrated that he wasn't learning anything. He wasn't learning karate. And then Mr. Miyagi proceeds to attack him and yell wax on, wax off. And the muscle memory that Daniel had built by doing this grunt work actually became the skills that he needed to defend himself in karate. And I always remember that analogy to say in an economy, like we have to remember if we're building for the future, whether it's for future companies, future leaders, future citizens, etc., we have to also, make sure that we're giving them the grounding, the training, the experience today to be able to do that.
Man, I love that overview. So, Sam, at the end of the day, everyone has a perception of you: family, friends, clients, readers, everyone that knows you, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
I'm a work in progress, I think is the best way I can describe it. Look, I'm a perpetual learner. I think I'm genuinely curious, and I think I'm grateful for that. I think it keeps life interesting. It keeps me moving forward. I care deeply about ideas and about people. I think I'm restless in a productive way. I'm always looking for the next challenge, the next mountain, the next thing to figure out. Um, and so, like when I write, I write from a place not of having it all figured out, but I'm writing from the trenches, same as everyone else. I just happen to find the trenches interesting.
So, if anybody wants the books, they want to catch you speaking, they want to hire you, they have questions, podcasts, any of the good business in your world, where do they go?
They can find me on my website, www.samsivarajan, Sivarajan, all one word.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm sure I'm the only Sam Sivarajan there. I write two newsletters on Substack, which they can find at theuncertaintyedge.com, all one word, or thegoodhumanpractice.com, all one word.
Sam, this has been wonderful. You're brilliant. Shine, sir. Thank you. Thank you for your story. Thank you for your wisdom. This has been wonderful. I appreciate it.
Joe, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
It was wonderful. Absolutely.